All right, welcome back. We now have a way to make objects that when we touch them and a certain object that we want to touches us, we can respond. We have a simple little debug message event that we can call to respond, but we want to do some more powerful things in response. Before we get there, we're going to want to respond to the object that touched us in this case, right? So if we go back to our mixin, we need to implement this. There will be the concept of, when we do this send message, there will be the concept of the message being received by the recipient. And this you'll have seen this before in other kind of event-driven programming paradigms. We need to have a recipient in the mixin. So different mixins may have different recipients. In our case, it's going to be the guy who did the touch, but in other cases, it may be a different game object. And that should be fair, right? Because it makes sense. If the player touches us, it should be the recipient of receiving the health buff. So what's our recipient going to be? It's going to be a private game object recipient. Okay, the object that receives the send message from the parent, from the last. Okay. And because it's private, we're going to need a couple helper functions. Set recipient. We'll just clobber recipient with REC because it will be the job of the actual mixin, not the base class, but the child class, to track how often this gets called. Sometimes we'll want to clobber what was already there. Sometimes we won't. It won't be the job of the base to track that. And we'll need another one, get recipient. It's okay, right? Pretty standard. Just a little getter setter. Okay. What does that mean? What that means is that in our touchable, well, okay, we'll go back to that. We're talking about an object that buffs an attribute. So we need some way to encode data in a mixin. I'm going to make a second folder. I'm going to call this data. We're going to make a new base class. I'm going to call it data. We could make this derived from mixin. We could have data mixin. We're just going to call this a different base class for now, called data. We're going to give it a name. We need that because we're going to have multiple datas of the same type, but with different names. Just like, score is an int, has a different name, but it has the same type as health, which might also be an int, but has a different name. We're going to implement the first data mixin, or data type component. We're going to call this an int data. As soon as I can use the new script wizard correctly. Here's take 3. Right click, create. I blame my clicky mouse touchpad here. This is going to be an int data. So it's an integer data component. So it's going to inherit from data, which is a mixin. And it's going to have a field called data. When the pattern we'll use for these datas is that the actual plain old data variable will always be called data, just as a convention. So whatever this thing is .data will always be the thing we want to change. Plain old data that we are encapsulating. We are going to need a get data that returns the actual data field. We are going to need a set data that takes an int data. And we're going to need a set data that takes an actual integer. Let's add one more. Let's add inc data that takes an int data. And another one that takes an integer. That's inc, so increment. It will make sense soon, please bear with me. Okay? So the first guy returns whatever value this thing is encapsulating. Set data is going to do what? How do we do that? I'll make this private if you want it. We can do that, but it's actually nice to see it in the editor. I'll make it private, and then I'll show you a way of showing private variables in the editor without allowing them to be changed. We'll call it public for now, and I'm going to revisit that. Make this private, but inspectable. Okay, and these two incrementers, they need to add. So data plus equals get data. Is that right? That seem fair? So we're doing this. We've got this wrapper component because we need a way to attach attributes to game objects in a data-driven way. This is the only way we can scroll down slightly. Sure. Sound good? Okay. And they have a name, which is good. Okay. So going back to our editor, if our health pack object is going to buff a certain attribute on the object that touches it, the pattern we're going to use, or the way we're going to do that, is by matching by name. So if the object has a thing called an attribute called life, and the hero has a thing called life, it'll apply the number from the object to the hero.
Could you just show the mix-in script for 1 second?
Mix-in, sure.
Yeah, I think I'm missing
Mix-in or data?
mix-in.
Sure. So we added set recipient and get recipient.
Just did the get recipient.
Yeah.
What's a public game object?
It's a game object. Because we actually, when we do the send message stuff, we're setting it to components attached to that game object. And we don't know what components are attached to this game object. We don't care. That's all done in the editor. So we're going to keep a reference to the game object. Show the what? In data? Okay. So get returns the data field, set goes into the parameter and pulls out the data field and applies it. Set on an integer, applies it. Increment gets it and adds it. Increment applies it. Okay? Okay. So this health pack is going to increase the health. What should we name our health variable? Health. So we're going to need to give our hero a health attribute. Okay, so it's an integer data and it's going to be called health, capital H-E-A-L-T-H. Health is going to start at 100. Let's start at 50. Who cares, right? It's an initial value. But there's a variable. Our hero now has health. The health pack object is going to increase our health, so we're going to add an attribute or a buff to it. Another int data. It has to have the same name, so we're going to call it health. How much is this thing going to do? Apply. What should this health pack be worth? This specific instance of a health pack should be worth how much? 15. I like it. We could make it negative 15. It could be a poison health pack if we want. But let's make it 15 and see what happens. Okay. With me so far? All right. So what does it mean to be a health pack that was touched and is now going to do its work? So a health pack that does its work after being told to do its work does what? It increases the health and then disappears. So we're going to say there's an aspect to the behavior of the health pack that means to apply buffs and then consume yourself and go away. What would be a nice name for this consumable object that goes away once you use it? Is consumable. Why not? So let's do that. So we'll make a new mix-in. So go back to your mix-ins folder, and we're actually going to implement is consumable. Is consumable. This is any generic consumable object, right? We know that our health pack is consumable and is touchable. So it's got both aspects to it. Okay? Going back to our script editor, double clicking on is consumable. What does it mean? So what is an aspect again? It's a simple little class that implements one aspect of this object's behavior. What is consumable going to implement? What should we call that method? If something is consumable, when we say do your work, it is going to consume. Very good. So this will apply all buffs attached to this object, to the object that touched us, then destroy self. So it's a one use kind of thing. We may have objects that you can touch and they don't consume themselves and disappear. You may be able to touch it and it still does some work, like on a timer, or maybe it does some work 5 times and then it dies, but that's a different aspect to its behavior. So we're implementing consumable, which is a one touch. And then fire and forget, do the adding and go away. Sound good? All right. So, destroy self. If I'm a component and I'm asking, and I want to implement a function that destroys the game object that I'm attached to, is that easy to do in Unity? How do we do that? That's right. We can just destroy, what, this? Is it this? This is game object, right? This is this script. This is consumable. We could destroy the consumable aspect, and that's possible. We can definitely like attach and detach aspects and then reconnect them on the fly. That's a really, really awesome way to do polymorphism. I'll show you that later. But we don't want to do that. We want this destroy self thing here. So what we really want is this. Agreed? Okay. So this other part of consumable, which is not a mono behavior, by the way, it is a mix-in. This first part is apply all buffs attached to this object to the object that touched us. Does this consumable know who touched us yet?
No.
Or no.
What aspect knows what object touched this object? The is touchable does. So we need to inform the consumable. Well, we need to inform the components attached to us based off of the specific nature of those components. So there's a special case here. We actually need to pass the recipient out onto the consumable for this to work. So let's see if we have one. If we have one, what are we going to do? We want to tell the consumable, you're an is consumable component. You want to send your message. You want to do your work on the guy that touched us. Right? So how do we tell the is consumable? The right recipient. We want to tell the consumable that your recipient is the guy that touched us. Is consumable is a mix-in, and the mix-in has a recipient. So we want the is consumable mix-in to have the recipient be the player. we do that?
If recipient equals this, or get component is player.
We've already done that up here, so we know it is the player. Now we want to say, oh, if there is a consumable attached to us, tell the consumable, your recipient is the guy that touched us. That's the consumable attached to us. How do we tell that component, your recipient is the player?
This dot get game object.
Where is the player? In this on-collision enter method, where is the player?
Oh, the collision.
Collision.gameObject, right? So we want to set recipient on the consumable to call the game object. Okay? The consumable will send this message to the player, and that's the player. In this specific case. Right? Moving on, so far so good. We'll go a bit more and then we'll circle back again. So in the consumable, apply all buffs attached to this object to the object that touched us. So we need to get the array of all attributes on the recipient. And then we need to get manage the array of all the buffs attached on this consumable object. Then if the names match, apply the delta increment. So we're gonna brute force it, right? There may be a better way to do this. Maybe we'll revisit this, but this will get us working. Some plain old computer science. So how do we get all the components attached to the recipient that are attributes? So what class are we using for attributes on our player? Our player right now has how many attributes? Just one, and it is of what type? It's an int data. So we're actually just going to get all the datas, because in the future we may have float datas, we may have vector3 datas. We're not sure yet. We can get a lot of mileage out of just int data. So we'll use the base here. Okay? So attributes is what? Who do we want to get? How do we get the attributes on the hero at this point? We want to get the components on some game object. What game object are we in right now? We're in the inconsumable component. What game object do we want to get the component on?
Or the person that touched me.
Yeah, and where's that stored right now? We just added it. The recipient of the consumable now is the player that touched us. So we're going to use our get recipient, because at this point we know that's set. Okay, that's a game object dot get components of what type? Just data, because we know datas are our attributes that consumable uses to buff things. Agreed? Similarly, we need another managed array of buffs, which is the stuff attached to us. How do I get the variables attached to me, the health pack? How do I get the components attached to me? There it is. That was not meant to be a trick question. That was meant to be a softball. Okay? And we're going to loop through. And if the names match, apply the add. Okay? How can we loop through? Can I do for each on these things? For each data buff, no, attrib in attribs. For each buff, buff in buffs. If the names match, add the buff to the attrib. Right? These arrays can be varying lengths because this is all just components that have been attached or detached to the game object. To both game objects, really. Should we run this and test it and see that it works so far? Let's just do a little test here. Set a breakpoint. Let's connect it. So here's our health pack object. What does our health pack object do right now when you touch it? Yeah, what is it? What method does it call? Let's make this actually try and do something that it wants to do. What do we change? That's right. So we're going to say consume. Hopefully we have an implementation of consume. We do because it's consumable. And we've got our in data. So let's just see. Hit run. Touch the process. Here's our guy. Gonna turn and walk forward. Boom, we hit our breakpoint. What is it? Tribs. It's an array of length 1 that has a int data. What is buffs? It's an array of length 1 that has a int data on a health pack object. So that's cool. So then in here, if the names match, we can add it. I'm going to take a quick break because it's the hour, and then when we hit back, we'll finish implementing that. And then our consumable will apply the buffs. We can see that it did the last part, which was destroy itself. So it went away. So it was consumable. It's now gone. It just doesn't actually do the math yet. Give it another 5 minutes, and then we'll be there.